Well, I first started getting interested in anthropology when I was an undergraduate at Northwestern University, and during my freshman year I took a class on the Maya and immediately fell in love with anthropology. But I wasn't sure that I wanted to pursue Maya studies at that point. I didn't really know what I wanted to do, but I was fascinated with anthropology, so I kept on taking more and more classes, and I decided eventually that I wanted to specialize in archaeology. So I finished with a degree in anthropology, but specializing in archaeology. And after I graduated, I did a field excavation in Belize, and I immediately fell in love with doing field research. I also, after finishing undergraduate, I also worked for the Field Museum of Natural History in Chicago. And there I was tasked to do research on cuna molas, which are a type of textile from Panama. And I looked at molas from the past 100 years or so. They have an amazing collection there. And under the tutelage of Dr. Alika Wali, I researched these textiles and investigated how the changes in mola styles occurred over time and ways in which women use these textiles to express their social identities. And so really that was a pivotal point for me in terms of getting interested in textiles. And ever since, I have been doing archaeological research as a graduate student, and now later as a postdoctoral scholar, and now as a professor at University of Montreal. I specialize primarily in ceramics, and I look at ceramic figurines in order to understand relationships between the state and households. And one of the research projects that I've been working on is to look at ways in which households conduct rituals and engage in certain beliefs that are either beyond the state or that are implicated in state ideas. And I look at that from looking at ceramic figurines that depict different supernatural figures, humans and animals. And as part of this research in Guatemala that I've been doing, I have been looking at textiles, and the way that I look at textiles is not from the actual textiles themselves, because in the tropical heat of the Maya region, textiles just don't preserve. What I've looked at are textile production tools like spindle whorls, bone weaving tools, bone needles, and I've charted their distribution at different sites in order to understand how textile production was organized in the classic period past. Another way that I've been looking at textiles is through the analysis of imagery. So that includes ceramic figurines, it includes painted ceramic vessels and murals, and by looking at the images of textiles, we can get an indirect sense of what the clothing of ancient Maya peoples were in the past. One of the draws that many people have to contemporary Maya textiles is that there's such a rich tradition of regionalism, where you have different styles, different techniques that are found in a town and its surrounding villages, and you can pick out a woman from her textile and say, I bet that woman is from Chichicastenango, or I bet she's from Shela, just by looking at the textiles. Some of the textiles that we see in the contemporary present appear to have also been produced in the past. And one of these textiles is what I like to call translucent weave, because we really don't know if it was a gauze weave. A gauze weave is a weave in which the warp threads are twisted and held in place by the weft threads, or if it was an open space weave in which it was a simple plain weave, but the spaces between the warp and weft are left open enough where you can see in between each thread. They're not tightly spaced together. So we don't know for sure if the classic period textiles were open or gauze, but we do have a few examples from the archaeological record in which there are cases of both gauze and open spaced weaves. And so indeed, we know archaeologically that there were these whisper-thin, translucent weaves that the classic producers made. One example is from sacred cenote from the site of Chichen Itza in Mexico, where textiles have been dredged from this watery environment because it's an anaerobic environment. It preserves things such as textiles, and they've found examples of gauze weaves that they probably date anywhere after the late classic period and on into the post-classic period. We also have examples from a site called Rio Azul, in which both open-spaced and gauze weaves were found in a burial 19 from Rio Azul, a royal burial. So we do know that these textiles were produced, but our richest source of evidence are really the images. I've examined at least 29 cases of translucent textiles and classic period images. They primarily come from painted media such as murals or from painted ceramics, which really embellish the details of the textiles. One example is a ceramic vase, which is unprovenient. We don't know where the vase was found, but its style indicates that the vase was probably produced in and around a site called Tikal, which was a large, powerful classic period site. This vase shows a woman that is wearing a translucent textile. It's drawn in a cross-hatching design, which may suggest that it was indeed a gauze weave, as very characteristic of gauze weaves today. It has beautiful fringe embellishment and an open neckline. Archaeologist and art historian Andrea Stone argues that this open scoop neckline is a sign of feminine beauty. This is one of the most typical ways in which women wore these translucent weaves in the past. They were worn as huipiles over a corte. A corte is a type of skirt, and their upper torso was left bare underneath the translucent textile. So this is the most common way that we see translucent textiles depicted. And as you can see, she's paired with a Maya ruler here. We know from the text he is from the site of Motul de San Jose. She is a noblewoman from the site of Tikal. So that gives us further evidence of the Tikal origins of this vessel. And what is she doing? She's in a pose of dance. And what's interesting about this scene is that even though she's paired to the left of the male figure, and slightly lower down, she really commands the scene. Her feathered headdress and her bodily motions really suggest a sense of presence. Now, what I find really interesting about the translucent textiles that are found in the different ceramic and ceramic media, as well as in the murals, is that you find them in all different types of vessels. So you find them in vessels that are of a different style and that are thought to have been produced in different polities. This vessel, for example, is a style called the Eek style, which we know from chemical sources of the vessel paste, as well as writing on the vessel itself, that these were produced, most of them, in and around a site called Motul de San Jose, the capital of the Eek kingdom. Now, this site was independent of Tikal at some time, but also was subordinate to Tikal during other times. But they expressed themselves differently. So the artisans from this site expressed themselves differently from the artisans of Tikal, at least in terms of the ceramic artisans. But yet, women from these sites are also portrayed with the same gauze or open weave, these translucent textiles. In this case, it's similar to the last vessel in the sense that she's paired with another man, and they are both dancing, and they're surrounded by musicians. And some scholars have argued that scenes such as this denote a type of marriage ceremony or betrothal. And we have other evidence of translucent weaves that are found from other sites. This particular vessel is really a rollout photo of a vessel called a co-textile vessel that is probably produced in and around a region in northern Peten and was under the domain of Calakmul, another powerful political entity in the classic period. Calakmul and Tikal were arch enemies, and here we have a woman with a cross-hatched wipil, scoop-necked wipil. Here we have an example of women wearing these translucent textiles depicted on vases that were produced in a different polity. So these textiles likely cross-cut these political divides and do not emphasize a regionalism that we see today. One of the interesting things about these textiles is they tend to be depicted on women, and not just any women, but women that are at the height of the reproductive years, that are youthful, that are shown as very beautiful. This is in contrast to elderly depictions of women that are depicted primarily only with a corte, which is basically a skirt, and their upper body exposed. So these textiles seem to denote a sense of femininity. And the textiles likely defined women as much as the women were defined by their textiles. The scenes that you see women wearing translucent textiles, one theme that you see them in are in these paired dance scenes in which perhaps they may be getting married or are somehow involved in a type of betrothal. But these types of scenes are not the only scenes in which women are wearing translucent textiles. They're also seen in market scenes. There is a rare case of a beautifully painted mural from the site of Calakmul in which women are wearing translucent textiles. Now in this case, women of what appears to be different statuses are wearing these translucent textiles. The very center of the scene is a woman who is wearing a very intricate blue textile, and you can clearly see her body through this blue textile. It has red and black hieroglyphs that are so intricately designed that they must have been either painted or embroidered in order to get the curve-like effect. And this woman obviously commands the scene. She really takes center stage in the scene. But there are other women that are also within the scene that are likely selling goods in a market context, and they also are wearing translucent textiles as well. So the textiles in this case are marking a sense of femininity, while perhaps the elaborateness of the textile is differentiating status in this context. In other cases, we have depictions of translucent textiles in a more ritual scene. So in the case of murals from the site of Bonampak, a number of women are wearing plain white translucent textiles. In some cases, they are letting blood. They're conducting rituals in which they are bloodletting. In other cases, they are within a scene of receiving tribute, receiving goods from visitors who are coming from afar. Were translucent textiles worn by men? It's possible. Although many of the translucent textiles that we find among classic period Maya depictions are found on women, there are some few rare examples that appear to be on men. And one example is a carving from the site of Bonampak, stone panel 1, in which 3 subordinate figures are seated in front of a Bonampak lord. And they wear these capes that you can see their hip cloths through the capes. And it is very possible that these men also wore translucent clothing. So in some of my excavations in Petén, Guatemala, I found spindle whorls as well as bone needles and bone perforators and pins that may have been used as bone weaving tools. And one of the questions that I had was, do common households, commoner households, do they bear the brunt of most of the textile production in Maya society? Because we do know from depictions as well as epigraphic evidence that textiles were one of the most common tribute items that were given to rulers and exchanged as gifts among all realms of society. But in charting the distribution of these textile production tools at a number of sites in Petén, Guatemala, I found that they tended to be concentrated in elite households or middle status households, and there were fewer in number. They were present in commoner households, but they were fewer in number. And it really suggests that textile production was quite intensive in these higher status households. So elite households were able to garner power through the labor of participants from their own homes. Probably many of them were women, although the tasks of textile production were very varied, and they range from producing the fibers, the cotton, the maguey, and other types of fibers, processing the fibers, cleaning them, dyeing them if they needed to be dyed, warping them, sizing them, warping them, not to mention spinning them, weaving them, decorating. So the number of people that were involved in textile production were quite numerous. And one scholar, Kathy Costin, argues that textile production was probably more labor intensive than any other craft combined. So one of the interesting things about the textile production tools that I found is that you find quite a variety. Some are bead shaped and fairly small, and they may have been better because they have high height to diameter ratios. They enabled a faster spin to the spindle, which was very conducive for short fibers like cotton. And so some of these smaller spindle whorls were most likely used to spin cotton, whereas some of the disc-like whorls that were a little bit larger and heavier may have been used to spin maguey or agave. And we know this because spinners today throughout Mesoamerica have their preferences in spindle whorls, and they tend to choose the smaller bead-shaped whorls for cotton and the larger disc-shaped whorls for maguey. But we really don't know that much about the spinning process in antiquity because the act of spinning today is really quite a lost art. There are so few spinners today, and I myself tried to spin, and it was a complete failure. It is very difficult to spin, not only spin, but to spin well. And we know in comparative cases, for example, among the Aztec chroniclers and Spanish priests who wrote down the lives of Aztec peoples, noted that it was often at 6 years old that a little girl started to spin. So spinning is an acquired talent that takes many, many years. There are impressions in plaster and in clay of textiles that fit the size and spacing parameters of open weaves that we know of today. And so it's very likely that these open space weaves were more widespread than the available evidence tell us. Many of these impressions have been collected from the site of Tikal, in which a number of burials have been excavated where these ceramic and plaster impressions have been found. Textile impressions on ceramics are actually quite rare. There is an interesting case in Petén, Guatemala, from the site of Aguateca, in which you have fabulous preservation because the site was rapidly abandoned, and a mask was recovered, and this mask was made out of an open weave, but it was with a thick thread, and the open weave sustained some sort of plaster that created a mask over, it was for a face mask. And the technology is somewhat similar to paper mache, in which you have a flexible material that you emplaster somehow and then it hardens. And they used an open weave textile in order to produce this mask. So there are a few depictions of weavers in the classic period. They come predominantly from ceramic figurines that model a female with a backstrap loom in the process of weaving. This indicates to us that weaving was a feminine activity in the past, as it is today. But of course, like all gendered activities, they may be dominated by one gender, but practiced more informally or by a minority of the other. So these roles are flexible, but we see from the iconographic record that weaving was a feminine ideal in the classic period. The ancient depictions, as well as the archaeological evidence of both gauze and open weaves, are undoubtedly very similar, if not identical, to those that are produced today in Alta Verapaz and in Chiapas, Mexico. One of the main differences that we see is how widespread they probably were in the past, and really how restricted they are now in terms of the communities that are producing these textiles today. But some of the techniques appear very similar. We see in the case from examples from the mural of Bonampak, both plain weaves, plain open weaves, or plain translucent textiles, as well as translucent textiles that likely had supplementary brocade decorations. And these types of decorations are found today among the open space weaves. One of the things these textiles really showcase is the importance of spinning in the past. We can appreciate the intricacy of the weaving process, but often forgotten is the art of spinning. And in order to produce these whisper-thin textiles, you really had to have the skill and talent to spin very, very thin, fine threads. And we know among the Aztec that girls started spinning when they were 6 years old. This is a talent that is acquired over the years, and the appreciation for these textiles is really understood when women wore them. So rather than being bundled up or folded in a storage space, when the textiles are on the human body, we really can appreciate the skill of the weaver, the skill of the spinner who produced these textiles. One of the most well-studied textiles from the classic period are these heavy brocaded textiles with these wonderful decorations on them. Also very commonly studied are jade beaded skirts and capes. Both of these clothing styles are worn for the most esteemed and prominent ceremonies of the state, period-ending ceremonies, accessions to office, and they're some of the most well-studied. Translucent textiles, however, are not well known from the classic period Maya, but they probably were quite common, in fact, more common than is known among contemporary populations who produce these gauze and open-spaced weaves today. But there was a real appreciation for these translucent textiles in the past, and we know that women wore them in all different types of contexts. One context is in the midst of dancing, perhaps at a wedding ceremony, and women would wear these whisper-thin textiles and be seen in the midst of dance performances. Other contexts include rituals, bloodletting ceremonies, or even in everyday settings. So the murals from Calakmul suggest that both common women as well as more elite women may have worn translucent textiles in market scenes or more public gatherings. So the value of these textiles were quite immense, and it's an appreciation that we are just beginning to acquire, the diversity of textiles that were worn in the past.